for tuning in to another episode of Live from COP. I'm Maia Sparkman, and I'm an Associate Director of Climate Diplomacy at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. I'm here joined by Angela Zhong, National Council Member of the United Nations Association, a leading voice in youth climate activism, to discuss pathways to reach climate goals and how conversations at COP28 are influencing global implementation. Angela, thanks so much for joining us today. So we're wrapping up for week one of COP28 and going into week two, where the negotiations really start to take place. So I'm wondering, what are you considering would make this a successful COP?
Yeah, absolutely. I know from the youth perspective, there's a number of different demands. The coalition as a whole has very divergent thoughts on whether or not there should be lobbyists from fossil fuel industries in the first place, and whether that's something that can be regulated within the UN system. Another topic of conversation is around energy and whether that can have its own sort of pathway in the negotiations. Personally, I'm really interested in the global stocktake and sort of where that puts us and our track towards hopefully carbon action and success. But we'll have to see moving forward. And my final thoughts here are that it started out with a bang with the loss and damage funds announcements, but I think really all eyes are on the fossil fuel phase out and whether that will be in the wording of the announcement.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing. And given your role with the United Nations Association, I'm wondering how you would advise the youth to stay energized and stay active in this climate dialogue to reach these climate goals and the decarbonization goals that we're looking forward to and for 2030, 2040, 2050, and beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the work that a lot of young people are doing is very, very exhausting. I think just being at COP, a lot of people are very tired. And so I think it's totally normal to feel these symptoms. And I think the biggest thing is that the youth right now are very good at communications, right? I think there's been a lot of energy around social media and an advocacy type strike push. And I'm totally for all of that. I think it's already made tons of change in the system, but I also think that there needs to be more accredited and professional youth who are working on very specific verticals, for example, methane reduction or water engineering when floods happen, because these things will continue to happen. And so I wonder if maybe we can plug in more there, because right now I see a lot of dominant industry forces who get to shape a lot of that conversation and narrative. But I don't think that always has to be the case, given our energy, our technical skills, etc.
Right. So it's finding that combination of the Gen Z generation and using their skills and their knowledge and know-how, but also applying it to the professional systems, professional setting instead of just the broader communication side of things. I guess one of my questions for you would be within this Gen Z youth engagement opportunities, how are you seeing youth creatively reach different types of communities on these various types of platforms? I feel like that's where I've been able to see a lot of wider communities being reached because of the way that the Gen Z community is able to have that creative touch with the social media platforms, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I think first we just grew up with these things, right? So I think it's just normal for us to communicate on these platforms. And I think because of that, we're just better at it than I think maybe some of our older counterparts. And that's okay. We all have their different strengths. Specifically with the youth climate movement, one thing that I've personally been very impressed by is how focused it is on addressing the people who need it the most. So we have acronyms like MAPA, which is most affected people in areas. And so we're trying to elevate those voices as well in the conversation. And obviously there are still tons of barriers to that, as is just for any least developed countries who are trying to attend COP28, right? You have to be able to speak fluent English or have a translator and pay for these things and skip class or whatever. And those are all levels of privilege. But I think as a whole, we are pretty aware and intersectional to account for these types of systemic problems. And every year there's more pushes to adjust for those, which is why there's youth negotiators and things like that.
Yeah. And so if you were able to give advice to your youth counterparts and colleagues and ways to get involved, ways to be able to be more present in these conversations and be more impactful as well, especially working with a wide range of folks within this climate and energy network, how would you provide some advice for folks looking to engage on these topics?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of advice I've been given is incredibly prescriptive as oh, you should like go down this route, or like this is what your skill set is. And I feel like it varies like so much from individual to individual. And so I think it's really important to just take an overall like look at the climate space and think about where you fit in best and what your theory of change is to drive like levers of power. Because otherwise, like, I think there's a lot of energy, but we need to like funnel that into action. And sometimes that doesn't translate through because like, yes, we need people to be like striking in the streets, but we also need people to be like discussing the technical aspects of how we're actually going to get this done. And so I'd like to see a better balance of that personally, but I think the movement as a whole like has really been a pioneer in this space already.
Right. So it's kind of like do the advocacy, but also be in the room to be able to find those solutions and pitch those to folks and actually implement those solutions as well. And I guess one more question. What are you most excited about, and what do you want to what are you hoping to focus your energy on as you continue to build out your career in this climate space?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think personally, because I study like economics and environmental policy, I'd like to do something along like voluntary carbon markets, Article 6, and climate financing. What actually got me started on doing climate as like something that I'm passionate about is I started learning about the social cost of carbon and how that like creates rippling effects on like cost benefit analyses and things like that. And so I want to sort of continue down that path. One thing that I've been like hyper fixated on recently, there's new like ESG disclosing standards with like the IFRS and ISSB, I believe, lots of acronyms. And so I think standard setting is really, really cool because if you set standards, you're basically influencing what sorts of metrics we can think about or like that are in our like possibility set whenever we're driving like goals forward. And so I think that's something that would be really cool to focus on.
Yeah, well, maybe a new major in these schools can be, in universities, can be standard setting, because I think that is a big topic on how to keep companies accountable and governments accountable as well, and kind of level set the playing field so that these changes can happen. And I guess my final question for you would be for the older generation that is still working in this climate space, since we've kind of grown up within the climate change topics kind of on the front of our minds. I guess how would you share with them how they can best work with like the younger generation as well?
Oh my gosh, I have so many thoughts here, but I think like the bare minimum I'm looking for from adults is to like listen to us instead of like dismissing us. Like just because we're young does not mean that we are like any less capable than them, because like we have been exposed to these skills at an earlier age. And also there are technologies that are skipping the need to do some of these skills in the first place and focus on what we actually want. But second is like, even if you don't have funding for different youth groups, or you can't like pass the policy you want or they want you to, that doesn't mean that you don't have like contributions that would really help their networks, right? The one thing that's different between adults, as if I'm not also an adult, but like older generations and young people, is that they have lived longer, right? And so they are parts of larger communities and like different workplace settings. And I think the least you can do is try to connect them, the youth, with someone who can help them, even if you're not in that exact position to at that moment. And so like giving a business card, responding to cold emails, I think are just like a common courtesy. And it would be really great to see that for youth people too, because like I just think we're no different than any other constituency in that way.
Right. Well, great. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. And thank you all for tuning in. And we'll see you for the next episode.